Okay, I think it's time that we can get started. I think it's 3 o'clock, maybe about a minute or two afterwards. So how's everybody doing today? I hope you guys are doing okay. We're going to get started. I wanted to make a couple of announcements. First of all, before we get going, and hopefully everybody can hear me. I've got the live transcription on, so hopefully that is, you're able to see that if you're unable to hear me very well, and so you can look for that. And please make sure you're muted. I know that we had a couple of participants. Looks like everyone's muted now, so that's great. I appreciate that. I wanted to mention, first of all, that the PowerPoint slides are all posted and available. Whatever the issue was there, we were having some, I don't know why we had that trouble. We had the trouble over the summer as well, and I know our distance learning people couldn't figure it out, and neither could I. And if they can't figure it out, I figured, well, that's if our tech people weren't able to get it. But they're up there now. And I want to say one thing about the PowerPoints. I know that sometimes people attach a lot of importance to the PowerPoints, and I don't know to what degree those are going to be all that helpful to you. And what they really serve to do is sort of track along with the class presentation, so that as I go along, you can kind of see what you can follow along with yourself. And I'll be putting those on the projector here. I'll move the camera over so you can see as it mirrors what I'm talking about. But that's really what those are for. You should be able to retrieve those. I don't know if you could download those to save too, but it's available in Brightspace, and so you should be able to view them. And it looks, since we've got this issue resolved, apparently, I should be able to update these prior to class as we go forward. So I apologize for the slight delay there. Hopefully that didn't impede anybody's ability to do anything at this point, but I didn't want to make them look sort of half-baked. I wanted them to look, look in a presentable sort of way. Okay, so those are available. Look for those under the course content screen. Also, I wanted to say something about discussions and participation in general. And I know I have had a number of questions. Oh, let me see here a minute. See if I can pick the screen up here. Shoot, what am I doing here? I'm going the wrong way. Never mind. I'm going the wrong way with the camera. Sorry about that. So let me focus in on the Brightspace screen here. So I just want to make sure that everybody's familiar with what you're doing here. I've had a number of questions from students because I've updated the grades from week 2, and I'll be looking at since we're in week 4 now, I'll be looking at week 3 sometime this week. But as I mentioned in my announcement on Monday, that because I gave everybody a bit of an amnesty to go back and add to their week 1 and week 2 submissions discussions, and I wanted to wait till everybody had a chance to do that. I went in, I believe it was Monday, and updated those. Now, a number of people have questions about those, but I think there's some misunderstanding. And by the way, I haven't checked my email today. I've kind of been running around a little bit, but if you have pending questions, I know a couple of people posted questions about grades, something kind of late last night. I will get to those today, I promise. But I want to make sure that everyone is familiar with what's going on here. And every week there's a discussion activity that you want to post to. And so you want to post it by day 4 of the week. And so the logic behind this is that whatever reading is assigned, and I know the textbook doesn't have a lot of reading that's particularly applicable to this. We're looking at switching up the textbook. So a lot of the content is class content. So I want everybody to sort of prioritize that over the reading. But nonetheless, the idea of the 4th day, the day 4, which is usually Thursday, unless there's a Monday holiday, is to have so that you have the opportunity to read the text and get an idea of what's happening, so you can make an informed and sound discussion by Thursday, and then post one other so one of the class participants, some kind of reply. It could be to me, it could be to somebody else. I usually post 3 or 4 times a week, when I have the chance, and just one other day during that class week. And the weeks run from Monday through Sunday. So Monday's day 1, Sunday's day 7. And I want to be sure too, because this is something that's been, we've been using Brightspace for a while, but for whatever reason, in the last couple of semesters, people have been saying toward the very end of the semester that they never could find discussions. I want to make sure that you're able to do it. So if you go into coursework, it's just right there, it's discussions, okay? It is not under the content module right here, which, as you can see, has got the weeks, what's happening just a checklist if you wanted to print it off, if you like to do that sort of thing. Any quiz we might have or exam would be there as well. Also, you can find any quizzes as well or exams there as well. So under the coursework, that coursework tab is really critical. You'll find that there as well. But discussions are all here under the discussions tab. So it's only 2 doors down from that. And most of you have found it. It doesn't seem to be a serious problem. I could put it here, but there's a reason why I do put it here. It's just because this way you've got the opportunity to go back and look at all other previous discussions. And one of the things that I think is of value to students is the opportunity to dialogue with others, to get to know other people, to get discussions going. And even though you might make posts after the week is ended, and there's no credit for those, I encourage you to do that, just because I think that's one way we learn is we learn from each other, we learn from experiences. And one of the things that I've said about economics for a very long time is that it's particularly relevant to all of us because we're all actors in the economic world. And so to the extent that we can discuss things with each other, I think is a good thing. So that's where you find those. So post on Thursday and one other day. By the way, you can post, if somebody has made their initial post, say Monday, Tuesday, there's no reason why you can't make that follow-up post even prior to your making the initial post of your own original content based upon the content. You can make that on Monday or Tuesday, whatever. Just one other day during the class week, that is all. And I allowed people to go back and add to the weeks 1 and week 2. Unfortunately, not that many people did that, and which is a little bit disappointing, but this is why I wanted to have this discussion so everyone is clear as to what's going on. Okay, I want to make sure that everybody what's happening, where to find it, where to see everything, etc., and all that. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything related to that? Well, I want to move on here, and I've got these are I've got the PowerPoint slides which relate to some of the content we've been talking about. Hello. Some of the content we've been talking about, and we're just going to finish up a bit from last week. We're just a little bit of catch up from last week. We talked about demand last week, and when we talk about demand, let me just kind of go over one more time what it is that we're really referring to with demand. Demand is this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And so if you remember from last time, when we talked about a demand curve, which is discussed a lot in chapter 3, you basically got an axis. You've got 2 axes, looks like this, vertical and horizontal. And we usually put the quantity axis on the horizontal axis, and we put the price axis, which is a dollar value, on the vertical axis. And we know that if, in one of the ways we determine what's happening with respect to demand is that we can measure. There are ways that we can measure demand, what's going on with demand from there. And one of the ways we can do it here, let me see here. Can you guys see that? Because I can't see that very well. Hold on a second, I'm on the wrong screen, first of all. Everything's backwards with regard to this room. In fact, swivel one way. There we go. I got the wrong. My apologies. Sorry about that. Everything's backwards. And so if we've got a price axis on the vertical price axis and a horizontal axis, we can, through estimation, we can decide what a demand curve looks like. And remember, it's sort of a snapshot view. And we've got these little observational points here. And then we can say that demand curve is a downward sloping curve looking something like that. And the fact that it's negatively sloped or downward sloping indicates that we've got this inverse relationship between P and Q, P being price, Q being quantity, and these are inversely related. Now, what we're doing in this first section of the class is we're simply talking about some of the basics of economics. And after we get through today's class session, and hopefully we get through everything that I wanted to talk about with regard to economic systems and government policy, whatever we don't get, we'll certainly cover next time. But we're going to get into a bit of economic history. And so, but before we do that, I just want to make sure that everybody's familiar with some of these very basic concepts of who the economic actors are. Like we covered the circular flow model. We talked a bit about opportunity cost and the production possibilities model. Well, here I just want to cover a bit of the basics. And I know that your text, and I've said this before, is very much more detail oriented as to demand and supply we're not going to be getting in this introductory class that level of detail, but it is worthwhile to read it and just to look at what's going on there. And I think you're going to find from quizzes and the first and second exams that it's not going to be anywhere near as in-depth as what some of the textbook discussions have presented it. But the textbooks are pretty good. They're a pretty good foundation to read. And one of the great things now about our world today is that you can find all kinds of resources everywhere as to economic information and whatnot. So a lot of it's available to you, and you should be able to see that relatively easily. Okay. All right. So anyway, so there's demand. That's what demand is all about. It's that inverse relationship between price and quantity, demand. Okay. And so what else can we say about it? So it's, and then we said that movements along the demand curve are due to changes in price. I know I'm covering a lot about what we covered last time, so this is a bit of review, I think. I'm going to try to hit some of the lights here because I think this might be more visible to you all if I drop the lights down just a little bit here. There we go. And that, yeah, it's a little better. It's a little better. And I know that we've got some limitations as to what we could do with PowerPoint slides in terms of the size of the font, and that may be a little bit small. So maybe if you've got any way to sort of look for yourself, you can look for yourself what's going on. So when we talk about shifts in demand, we're talking about a change in the entire demand function. Something is going on which has changed the entire relationship between price and quantity demanded, and that is these non-price variables. And I talked about these last time, so I don't want to spend a great deal of time going over them because I do want to get into. There are things that will move the demand curve, because if you think about this demand curve, it's a snapshot. You want to take a photo of it at any one point in time, saying this is the demand for this good, whatever this is. Pizza in Albuquerque, shoes in Arizona, whatever the market is. Take a picture of it, and because it's going to change, and it's going to change because of these things: changes in income, changes in tastes and preferences, substitution, goods coming along to replace other goods. We see goods go away all the time because new goods are coming along, and the price of complementary goods. Now, we have been in a situation where gasoline's been relatively expensive. I know it's come down some since the summer, but if it stays elevated, we have seen this dynamic over many years. If the price of gas stays high, a complementary good to gas is obviously cars and trucks. People will tend to dial down the size of vehicles in order to use less gas because gas is expensive. So gasoline and cars are complementary goods. Demand for one will follow demand for the other. We'll probably try to buy less gasoline to the extent that we can, as difficult as that is for most of us. But one thing that we can do to deal with higher gas prices in the long run, is to buy more fuel efficient vehicles. And we certainly saw it happening during the major price spikes in the late 1970s, where the size of cars came way, way, way down. If you've ever seen old TV shows in the 60s and 70s, these and now it became much smaller and much more fuel efficient. People have demanded that, and I suspect that as we go to electric vehicles, we'll have an even more, what the value of electricity is with regard to the value of those vehicles. Something new. So anyway, so those are shifts in demand. That is what can move the demand curve to the right, to the left. A rightward increase, as we said last time, was an increase in overall demand. Something has changed in the demand equation. People's preferences have changed, whatever. The prices of related goods like substitutes and complements have changed, and so as a result has altered our demand for whatever the good in question that's being modeled. A leftward shift is a decrease in overall demand. So, and that's pretty much what you want to know from there. Let's talk about supply, okay? Because this is where we left off last time. We talked about demand, but let's talk about supply. Supply is sort of the opposite, and I know that we have talked forever, and I mentioned this in class last. Pretty much our whole lives, if you're like most people, you've been in conversations where people have said, "Hey, why is the price of this good why it is?" And somebody would say, "Well, it's supply and demand." Like whether it's the price of housing. I mean, you see housing in the last few years skyrocket in price. One reason why is there's been a limited supply of housing and lots of demand for housing, and so as a result, prices have gone up. It's just that simple dynamic between demand and supply. And so But the thing about it is supply and demand work together, and they're sort of flip sides of the same coin, but they are quite different though. And in fact, I don't think it's breaking any new ground here to say that the motivations of suppliers is really opposite those of demanders or buyers. And so we talk about supply, we're talking about the ability and willingness. And again, I come back to this phrase here, ability and willingness, that I focused on last time. It's got to be both. Of what? Of potential sellers, not just sellers, but potential sellers, to offer goods for sale at various prices and quantities. Now, why is this ability and willingness got to be there? Well, it's got to be there because otherwise you might have the ability to supply goods at a particular price and particular quantity, but you don't want to. You don't want to do that. And I'll give you an example. Let's just take the gasoline example. Okay, right now gasoline prices are high, but I can recall in the 90s when I was working in banking, we had a number of customers who had gas stations, and the price of gasoline fallen dramatically. And to the point where they weren't making as much. Yeah, they were selling a lot, but the price of gasoline was falling dramatically and whatnot. So a lot of gasoline providers, retailers were saying, well, why should I stay open all midnight or 24 hours a day? It's extremely competitive because the price is so low. Everyone's cutting each other's throats. And so as a result, why do I want to offer, and be open 24 hours a day? So they're cutting back. And this is around the time in which gas stations really stopped becoming gas stations and started offering, snacks and drinks and donuts and all these other things, because it was a way to, to make up for some of the competitive environment. They really don't want you just to buy gas. They don't really believe it or not, the retailers don't make that much money on gas, but you're coming to get gas as a way to get you there to buy other things like cigarettes and whatever. I mean, the list goes on, right? And so, gas stations used to be places where you can oil change and you get your car worked on and brakes fixed and whatnot. Today, that's not so much the case. It's more of a retail operation that just happens to have gas pumps, which is why we saw 7-Elevens and Circle K, which once were strictly retailers offering gas. It's another way to take demand away from what were pure gas stations. So it's the ability and willingness to provide goods for sale at various prices and quantities. You might have the ability, but not the willingness, or you might have the willingness, but not the ability. So I would imagine that there's probably great demand for electric vehicles still, and yet I know that the electric vehicle supply part of the whole supply chain is not probably there yet in terms of supplying more. As they supply more, I suspect the price will come down even further. Right now they just don't have so much the ability to do that. Also, I know that one market which has been really, and we've heard a lot about supply constraints and supply chain problems, just more than I think I've ever heard in my life since the pandemic began. But take the airline industry. Right now, people are demanding airline tickets like crazy, to the point where it's hard to get seats on flights. And of course, the prices have gone skyrocketing. And the airlines are saying, we just can't provide more seats. We've only got X number of seats. It's not like we can go buy, 10 or 12 new 737s. I mean, we've got to order those years at a time. And it's not like going to Walmart and picking one up, right? So the ability is not there. So it's got to be both. Just like in demand, it's got to be both. So the law of supply, and remember, as I said last time, we've got very, very few laws in economics, unlike physics and chemistry and mathematics. And the law of demand that we talked about, which talked about this inverse relationship, that is, as one thing goes up, the other thing goes down with demand. In supply, it's a much more firm relationship that is price and quantity are positively or directly related. And that's a pretty strong law. I think we can almost hang our hat on that one as maybe the only really, really strong law of supply. And the reason for that is the fact that unlike demand, where there are some goods that don't behave, we call them ill-behaved functions that, as the price goes up, people demand more of that particular good. Extreme luxury goods like Rolex watches and, things like, and, very expensive vehicles and whatnot, they become attractive because the price goes up. High-end art purchases, as the price of art goes up, people want to demand more art because why? Because the price is going up. And but those are not commonly purchased goods. I don't know too many people who buy high-end art and who buy, you know, expensive watches on a routine basis. But for the most part, most goods obey the law of demand. But in the case of law of supply, I can't think of any suppliers who don't obey the law of supply, because it almost doesn't make sense. There's really no rationale by which you would not obey the law of supply. And that is the idea that price and quantity are directly or positively related. And so movements along that curve are due to changes in price. And so just to kind of show you what is going on here with, I think I've lost my markers here. With respect to this, let's kind of swivel back over to our graph here. And let's see here. There we go. And everything is backwards. And so, so if we've got a downward sloping demand curve, I'm going to bring the light up just a little bit here. What do we have with supply? Supply is upward sloping. And so we have this sort of X formation. So supply is upward sloping, meaning as the price of the good goes up, suppliers provide more goods for sale. And so price goes up, suppliers provide more. Price goes down, suppliers provide less quantity. And it makes sense, right? If you're a supplier, you provide more quantity. I do believe that, again, we're talking about ability and willingness. I do believe the airlines would love to supply more seats to meet the demand that is out there right now, but they just can't do it. And by the way, one of these constraints too that we haven't really even talked about very much yet, but we're going to be starting to talk quite a lot about beginning next week, is the idea of labor. And we have had all kinds of economic stories about labor supply issues. And keep in mind that, remember, we go back to the circular flow model. One of the things that is supplied by households beyond just the demand for goods is labor. And right now, there's just not enough labor being supplied to meet the demand for labor. This is probably a pretty good time still to go find a job if you want one. I think I mentioned in class last week that I, for one, and I'm just an ordinary person, I, for one, have been seeing lots of ads for people to come work for their store. I mean, Walmart, for instance, has usually got like a hiring table where they're offering $15 per hour to start. These are very entry-level wages. I had mentioned in one of my classes that I was in Subway not too long ago, and I saw an offer for $16.50 an hour. I think I may have mentioned that last time. $16.50 an hour, that's a pretty good wage. That's well above minimum wage, well above minimum wage. And on a full-time basis, if that is a full-time offer, that's about $33,000 a year. That doesn't include any overtime. And I know that right now, a lot of people are getting lots of overtime in order to fill the gap that is not there from workers. And so it's a good time in the labor market. I would say this, though, that we're seeing, and we saw it just again today, interest rates going up, and I think that's going to slow the economy down. I do believe, it's my opinion, having done this for a while, that we're probably looking at a recession looming very, very soon. I don't think there's a lot of doubt in my mind. Economists will always disagree. So I think if you're going to find a job, maybe now is a good time to get moving on that, because I think a year from now, the market is going to be entirely different. I can almost guarantee you that. And just given our experience with higher interest rates to slow the economy down, because, and that's a sign that the economy probably needs to slow down. If you've got very entry-level jobs paying, you know, and forget about the minimum wage, for instance. I mean, the minimum wage is almost irrelevant. It's not even, I mean, it doesn't have that much to do with workers who've been in the labor force for a while. It's mostly an entry-level wage, and it's usually paid grudgingly to workers by employers. I know that when I first entered the workforce, it was our employer moaned and groaned about paying the minimum wage because they thought it was too high. But once people are out in the workforce a while, minimum wage becomes mostly irrelevant. What I'm saying is, if you've got these wages that are high, they're much higher than what they had been previously, that's probably a sign the economy is growing too quickly. The Federal Reserve is moving to lower interest rates. And we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve hopefully tonight and talk about what they do and why they do it. For those of you who have any kind of passing interest in the news, you will have seen that the Federal Reserve raised interest rates again today to try to slow things down. And I think the labor market is going to feel the effects. Why hasn't the labor market felt it? already, it's because it's what we call a lagging indicator. Business firms are reluctant to lower wages. They're also reluctant to lay people off. And I think that these things take a while to kick in, but we will see it. So labor supply right now is in a good position, but it's probably going to change. And so these are the things that this is one of the value of taking class in economics, is to be able to see these kinds of things happening. One of the things I can absolutely guarantee you, I may be wrong about unemployment and the recession that I think is coming. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. It happens. But one of the things I can absolutely guarantee you is that things are going to change. That there's nothing that's nailed down. And so demand and supply for individual goods is going to change, and the macroeconomy itself, things are going to change. That I can almost guarantee you. It kind of goes back to this idea of JP Morgan, the banker over 100 years ago was asked, hey, what's the stock market going to do? And he said, it's going to fluctuate. And he correction, but he was pretty sure it was going to move, and it did, and it has, and it will, and all these economic variables are moving. So this is what supply looks like. This upward sloping curve, okay, upward sloping function. So let's talk a bit about supply. And so any movements along that supply curve are due to changes in price and changes in price only. But just like demand, these curves can move. If it's a rightward shift, it's an increase. It's a leftward shift, it's a decrease. What's going on is the supply curve is a snapshot. It's a photo you take, snap. It's going to change. And it's going to change because of these things which are causing it to change, which are outside of the system. We call those exogenous variables. That's a word, I wouldn't write that down, but it's also, these are things which are outside of the system we call non-price variables. So the question, what could cause supply to shift? The answer is changes in non-price variables, known as the determinants of supply. In other words, these are the chemical formulas that are baked into the supply function. And then if they change, they move the supply to the right as an increase, and as suppliers are more willing to supply more quantity at every price, or to the left, they're willing to supply less quantity at every price. And so what are these? What are these non-price factors? And we say this is the same language that we used in demand. We said non-price variables, non-price variables. That is, we're not talking about the price of the good. I know that very often we're tempted to say, hey, if the price changes, then supply shifts. We're saying that quantity supply will shift, not the entire curve itself. If the price goes up, people will supply more quantity. Price goes down, they'll supply less quantity. But it's not going to move the entire function, because those are due to things that are outside of the system, outside of the PQ model. And the number one, the biggest by far, even bigger than any of the, its relationship to the determinants of supply is much more prominent, I think, than any of the determinants of demand in relation to that function. And the number one issue is changing cost of production. It's a huge, huge, huge variable. If it costs more to produce output, you're going to supply less output. It is sort of a law of nature when it comes to supply. If it costs you more to do something, you're going to do less of it. And as a result, because why? Because you'll do less of one thing and do maybe more of something else, whatever that case might be. For a long time, one of those big cost of production, we're talking about inside the cost structure of producers. And for a long time, we talked about wages as being a big element. To most firms that supply output, most businesses that supply output, wages are a big component of that. And I think that one of the issues with wages right now is wages have gone up, and they've gone up pretty dramatically. They've also gone up because and you've got really a double whammy going on there. You've got great demand for labor, and also labor supply has been sort of constricted. It really hasn't bounced back all that much, even though the pandemic is, I guess, officially over. At least the president declared it over the weekend. But a lot of people haven't come back into the workforce for all kinds of reasons. And this is particularly true of older workers, who, a lot of whom did not get into the workforce as much during the pandemic for health reasons. Obviously, if you feel like you've got a health condition, you don't want to risk it, and then maybe you don't want to go into work, and maybe you want to work at home more, but that still puts you in the labor force, working at home. But maybe you don't want to go back into the workforce at all. We've seen a lot of people retiring early to the extent that they are able to do it. And so as a result, labor costs have gone up because of the shortage. So yeah, it's a double whammy in that regard. And the idea is that if wage costs continue to go up, then we'll certainly see firms sort of back away from certain markets that are very heavily dependent upon labor. By the way, there's a longer term story. We're going to be getting into this in the next few weeks. It's a long run, long term, hundreds of years old story about technology and where that comes into play. And I bring up the labor piece because it leads us to our next topic here, changes in technology and innovation. And that is what? One of the things I think most of us know, just from our own experience, and if our experience is correct, that what is the preference of business firms over time? Do they like technology? Do they want to buy technology? Well, it doesn't matter what they like or they want it, they adopt technology and innovate technologically, if for no other reason they have no choice but to do so. And by the way, the long run conflict, I guess you ought to say, we might say, is between labor and technology. And I have long put this to students, where I've said to students, you know, if you're a business and you got and you'd rather pay $100,000 to labor to do a certain thing, or $100,000 for machinery to do the very same thing, which would you prefer? And almost invariably, most students will say the technology, the machines, and labor has been, certain labor has been replaced over time by machinery. It's been a long run thing. And the thing about technology is it's almost always results in a rightward shift in supply. Technology, unless it makes sense to do so. And it might do it kicking and screaming because their competition has done it. I know that retailers that really resisted the optical scanning technology that came out, I think in the 80s, where you scan barcodes. I mean, today we've been doing this forever now. Just, you know, now people check themselves out. But a lot of firms didn't really want to do that because it was expensive, that technology. But then they found out, hey, we can hire fewer cashiers, and our customers are happier because we can open, you know, 6 or 8 of these lanes and they can scan themselves out. And we don't need anybody at all, maybe one person to watch over 6 or 8 lanes instead of 6 or 8 cashiers. That job of cashier is rapidly going away because it's not really needed. And we're going to get into this a bit more as we talk about the history of economics, this idea of technology replacing labor. And I know the fears have been around for a long time. It's sort of made its way into science fiction. What's going to happen if the machines replace all labor? It's an ancient fear. It goes back to really the beginning of industrialization. The good news is, contrary to what a lot of people feared might happen, is that yes, labor in the very short run does get replaced, but labor moves on to go somewhere else, and technology simply does whatever it replaced. And so we've seen lots of jobs disappear: telephone operators, cashiers, elevator operators, people who pump gas. They used to pump gas for us. We don't need those occupations. And so technology allows firms to do things better, cheaper, and faster. That allows them to shift to produce more output. And this is one of the reasons why our economy has grown, despite the fact that a lot of people, you know, criticize this idea that it does replace labor. Okay, so moving quickly on here. So changes of technology and innovation. By the way, this is also responsible for lowering cost of production. A firm wouldn't do it at all if it didn't make sense to bring in technology. And I know that we are long since past the time when firms were adopting computer technology. Any firm of any size has got to have computer technology, and mostly the latest. I am old enough, unfortunately, to remember the time when a lot of businesses, you know, were really dragged kicking and screaming into the computer age. Didn't want all thinking that computers were somehow scary, dangerous, complicated. They're not really any of those, as we all know. The fact that we're all here using computers kind of tells us that. So that fear of technology is largely going away, which I think is a good thing. Number of sellers in the market, this is very easy to understand. If there are new firms coming in, new suppliers, then it will shift to the right because an increase in overall supply. As sellers leave, the supply curve will go the opposite direction. Again, none of these have anything to do with the price of the good itself, whatever the market is that we're talking about. So if sellers come in for whatever reason, it tends to drive prices down. I mentioned last week, and by the way, if anybody has any questions, you can chime in, and you know it's fine, or you can put something in the chat box. I think I can. Let me see. I can bring that up here. I just ask everybody to sort of mute themselves. but it's fine if you want to pop in and say, hey, I need to get that or whatever. I'm not saying don't speak. I'm just saying, just make sure that we don't have a lot of competing voices. So number of sellers in the market, whatever the reasons are that firms come in. We talked last week about this idea of the pizza market, where pizzas have come down in price because there's so many sellers in the market. I mean, there's so much competition. The price of pizza, we're sort of in almost a price war, I think, within local markets where we've got so many competitors. And as a result of that rightward shift in supply, it's brought price down. They're not exactly scarce. It's not really hard to find somebody to deliver a pizza to your house. And so we're seeing a number of sellers that have risen in that market. We've seen this also with a lot of other goods as well. Cell phones are not exactly scarce these days, and cell phone providers. Pretty much everybody's got a cell phone. I know there are probably some people who don't, but almost everybody. If my mother lived to be in her 80s and she was on her cell phone all the time, and so if she could handle it, believe me, I think most everybody else can handle that. So as a result, number of sellers affects it. Government policy, we're going to get into this today. Taxation, government spending, regulation. What I want to focus on here with regard to supply is this idea of government policy, taxation and regulation in particular. So one of the things about taxation that we should be aware of is taxation really is a cost of doing business. So if the cost of taxation goes up, we tend to supply less output. Now, by the way, we saw something very similar happening with regard to corporate taxes, where a big trend in the business world, particularly in really, really big businesses, not small businesses, but big businesses, is that the US tax rates on corporations was relatively high in relation to other countries. And so a lot of firms were simply moving their corporate headquarters to places in the world that had lower corporate tax rates. One of the Republic of Ireland, which is a little bit surprising. And that was drug companies, tech companies, all shifting to go there. This is one of the reasons why the Tax Act, was called the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 was passed, was to dramatically lower corporate tax rates to stop this exodus. So a firm might not quit making drugs altogether. They might not stop making pharmaceuticals. They just might move operations to where there's less tax. When it comes to regulation, this has been a long running story with regards to firms that have been moving operations overseas because of less regulation. Fewer labor regulations, fewer wage regulations, environmental regulations. We've seen companies go or move, particularly in manufacturing, pull up stakes out of America and go to the Far East, go to Latin America, go to all kinds of places where there's less of that going on. So if those are rising, there's simply a cost of doing business. So we're going to talk a bit more about taxes in general. Not so much corporate tax. I don't want anybody to think this is a tax class, but we're going to talk about it from the economic standpoint. And there'll be much more on tax as we get into talking about the history of economics. And then finally, the last one is business outlook and expectations. And I do want to sort of get into the content from chat that we wanted to talk about with regard to this week, and that is sort of the history of economics a little bit in terms of systems and also government. Business outlook is if businesses feel very confident about what's happening, they'll supply more output. That is, what is their future expectation? So forecasts is another word for this. And bigger businesses tend to do a lot of forecasting, much more than smaller businesses. And if they feel very good about things, they'll supply more output, meaning what? They'll hire more workers, they'll buy more machines and trucks to move things and all that. If they feel less good about things, they'll pull everything back in the other direction. Right now, the business sector is feeling very skittish about what's happening. They're very nervous about the fact that interest rates are skyrocketing. And so as a result, they are not feeling very confident about what is coming down the road, much more than ordinary consumers. And ordinary consumers are still feeling relatively optimistic. But as I mentioned earlier, the labor market is a lagging indicator. It will come where there'll be less employment. We're already starting to see some signs of some weakness in the labor market. Some firms laying off, especially real estate related. In the mortgage business, they were laying off people like crazy. And so we're starting to see that happen. So if the firms feel very nervous about things, there'll be a left shift, a decrease in supply because of the fact that why do you want to do something when it's going to cost you more to do? Final point on this, and if you have questions, let me know, is equilibrium. So what I drew on the board here was a sort of X configuration, upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand. And so when we talk about equilibrium is sort of a state of nature throughout the world itself. And that is the idea that things come in and they sort of settle into a place for a period of time. And we call it a state of relative short-term balance as to price and quantity. Now, how long is the short run? Well, it depends. And I know that sounds like an economist's answer. It depends. Well, it does depend. It depends on when something moves supply or when it moves demand or it moves both. And that's indeterminate. And there are some markets that are very, very stable where the prices don't change very much because demand and supply are relatively stable. So as a result, there are some markets in which the prices are relatively stable for very long periods of time. Things like medical products and whatnot, and insurance products. We don't see skyrocketing prices of insurance generally, or great dramatic drops in the prices of insurance, whether it's auto insurance, life insurance, whatever. Those are relatively stable markets. On the other hand, there are some markets that are wildly unstable because things are shifting all the time. Energy is one of the big ones here, where gasoline, which is a derivative of oil prices are up, they're down, up, down, up, down. I mean, it's only been the last 2 years where the price of oil was actually negative for a couple of hours. And you wonder how can you have negative prices? It's just because of the technical nature of trading. Nobody wanted to buy oil. And so if nobody wants to buy oil, the computers automatically just keep marking the price down. And so it was like negative $40. Now, it doesn't mean that you can buy oil and somebody will pay you and give you the oil. It just means that the market was out of whack greatly because nobody wanted to buy oil in the middle of the pandemic. So it's been negative, and it's been also about $100 higher than that, or more than $100 higher than that. So it's wildly up and down. And so when people were paying $4.30, $4.50 for gas, I told my classes, well, just wait, it will come down, it will come down. Probably not very quickly, but it will come down because it always does. And we've seen it coming slowly but surely. So some markets are very volatile, some are not. And volatility is simply this degree by which supply and demand shift based upon all kinds of factors that bear into it, not having to do with the price of the good itself. And so finally here, equilibrium price is the price at which equilibrium quantity is established, in which there are no surpluses and no shortages. And that's just to sort of wrap this up here a little bit. Let's talk just a bit about what we're doing here with regard to supply and demand. I'm going to sort of bring the lights up a little bit here and talk about equilibrium and what equilibrium looks like. And if you've been reading chapter 3, or there's all kinds of places online you can get this information as well. But if we talk about equilibrium, if we've got this intersection between demand and supply here, there's no ink in that, unfortunately. So intersection of demand and supply, then we've got a point at which we've got an equilibrium price here. And we usually put a little star by it or an asterisk, we just pronounce it P star. It's equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity there. And when we're talking about a market's equilibrium, we're saying that the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. There are cases in which the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. The quantity supplied is here, the quantity demanded is here. We call that a surplus. There is too much being produced relative to demand. So what happens is suppliers get the message when goods are stacking up on shelves, or when the phones aren't ringing, or whatever the product is. If it's a service, maybe the phones aren't ringing. And so as a result, they have to dial down the price because they're offering at a too high of a price, and people don't want to pay that price. Ultimately, it will move its way back to equilibrium. We're saying that equilibrium surplus is an out of equilibrium condition. And if it sells goods and goods are stacking up, they're not moving, well, what does a firm do? Lowers the price of the good to get rid of that stuff. What do retailers do the day after Christmas? They want to get rid of all that wrapping paper. They mark it down, mark it down, mark it down to get rid of it. Even if they have to take a loss, they want to get rid of it because it's not needed. It's surplus, right? Same goes if you've got quantity demand being greater than quantity supply. People are banging on the doors to get a good. Suppliers would love to supply more, they just can't do it. So as a result, you've got where we were in during the pandemic, where we had people who wanted to buy more product than what firms were able to sell. Not that they weren't willing to sell, but they weren't able to sell. We heard all kinds of stories about ships carrying cargo that were stacked up one behind each other in the Pacific, waiting to dock at Long Beach Harbor in LA, and couldn't do it because there weren't enough people to unload the ships. And so as a result, this is one of the reasons why this whole interconnectedness of markets took effect, and we saw shortages of lots of goods. Lots of goods were short, and particularly goods that came from overseas, and they had to come from a distance. There was a greater quantity demanded than there was quantity supplied, and so as a result, the market would clear what we call clearance. It's called a market clearing quantity is here, but we're instead here, and so as a result, it's an out of equilibrium condition. So, and the price at which we have this clearing quantity is called the market clearing price. The market clearing price. I believe there's a question in your quiz that dealt with that, the market clearing price. It's the price at which there's no surplus and there's no shortage. No surplus and no shortage, okay? All right, so that's all that I really wanted to get into there. There's a lot more that you can read about in chapter 3, excuse me, with regards to this. And it does get fairly detailed. And again, this is about as far as I think is appropriate to get in this particular course. For those of you who go on to take either micro or macro, you will have much more exposure to some of these dynamics, particularly in terms of what happens when you have supply and demand both shifting and all that. And you will have the opportunity to get into that. This is all I want to do. Instead, what I want to sort of get into is I want to talk a bit more about some of the other content I want to get into, which has to do with sort of a lead into where the rest of the course is going. And we're going to sort of finish. If I don't get through this today, we've got about 25 minutes, and we'll pick it up next week. But then we're going to spend several weeks talking about some of the history of economics so that you can sort of see how we got to where we are. And we're going to start this with this discussion of economic systems. I know that we had a discussion activity, I believe it was week 2, because we're, as I mentioned at the outset of the class, we're sort of weaving in and out of these introductory concepts, particularly in the readings. And hopefully everyone's had a chance to do a lot of the readings, basically the first 3 chapters in the McConnell book. And there's a discussion that we had in the Brightspace site dealing with economic systems. So we really got 2 polar opposites, 2 polar extremes. Pure capitalism on one side, pure command on the other. When we say polar opposites, we're basically talking however you want to think about this, North Pole, South Pole, however you want to think about it, they're opposite. And so what is a capitalist system, also known as a laissez-faire, which is a French term that means vaguely is to leave be or to leave to do, I think is more technically how it means. Laissez-faire is one of the terms that's used in the book. It's the same as capitalist, whereas private ownership of property is sort of the main feature of this, where anybody can own property, and whether that property is real estate or other what we call real properties, anything which is real estate connected, but also non-real properties, which is called personal property. We're able to own that, and then the profit motivation, particularly on the supply side, is honored and it's also rewarded. There's a great motivation that people have to earn a profit. And this is a real hallmark, I think, of what a capitalist system is all about. This idea that sellers can make a profit, but also the profit is not just limited to a business firm concept among these actors that we talked about in the circular flow model. It's not just businesses, it's also individuals. That is, if you want to become a highly, I need to move the camera. I'm sorry here. I move the camera, but there we go. Sorry. So economic systems. Sorry. The polar opposites here of capitalism and command. So if you want to become a highly paid person, you want to go to medical school, become a surgeon, you've got the right to do that. And it doesn't mean that you can do that. Maybe you don't have the ability to do it. Maybe there's, maybe you're not able to do it for whatever reason. But you get the freedom to do it, and you can get or to do whatever else you want. You want to start a band, you start a band, and you can do it. You don't have to run it by anybody. You just simply have to do it. It's your own particular choice. And this idea of free choice sometimes leads to mistakes being made. And I think that we learn from mistakes, and we are going to talk, particularly when we get into the work of the economist Milton Friedman, who was sort of a great proponent of this gospel of choice, this idea that we have the freedom to do what it is that we want to do in the economic realm. The government doesn't control all the action as it does, particularly in these other two systems, particularly in this one that's polar opposite of command. And that's the idea that we're free to make our own mistakes too, right? Maybe you start a band and it doesn't do anything, right? Well, I'm sure that happens. It happens all the time. But nonetheless, it sometimes does work out. And so, a capitalist system allows people to make their own choices and to pursue their own particular private motivation. If you go back to the circular flow model, where we talk about the private sector, right? That is, businesses and households together constitute the private sector, that is non-governmental sector. It is the idea, we said there were two main characteristics, and that was that decisions tend to be made privately, and they also tend to be made in their own particular interest. So if you're a household, you want to add on to your house, you just simply do it. You might have to get a building permit to do it, but you don't have to talk to anybody. You don't have to get a commission to, usually, you get the idea. Something routine like that is your choice to do. If you want to sell a car, sell your car, right? If you want to buy a new refrigerator, then you are free to do that. So it's not just a business firm concept, it's also an individual concept. And I want to sort of skip socialism and come down to the polar opposite. So whether this is North Pole, South Pole, whatever, these are polar opposites. Pure capitalism or laissez-faire. Pure command is just the opposite. This is government control ownership of most production activities. And what's going on here is, and it's also consumption activities. I probably should have indicated that consumption activities are largely controlled as well, because in the old Soviet Union, the idea of buying a refrigerator meant you had to get your name on a list, wait for a refrigerator to be available for you. And if you didn't like the color of the refrigerator was, well, you're just out of luck. You get this color of refrigerator or whatever color of vehicle that you're going to get or whatever style. So government tends to control and run most of the activities. And one of the things that you may have come across, and in fact, we had a pretty good discussion. I really thought everybody did a great job in this discussion activity about these economic systems. And that was the idea of the fact that command economies tend to be going away. We don't have nearly as many of them as we did maybe 30 years ago. The Soviet Union was sort of the exemplar of the pure command economy, where you had these production quotas that factory managers were given from on high, from government. Government was the main decider that would, or the main decision maker that would say, this is how much toothpaste we're going to create. This is how many bushels of wheat we're going to grow. And it was at very micro levels as well for individual plants, individual farms and whatnot. And the problem is that it is really, really difficult for governments to control all these activities. One of the things we'll talk a bit about as we get going in subsequent weeks about the work of some economists who are sort of collectively known as the Austrian school. And there was an economist named Friedrich Hayek, who really was very much opposed to this idea of command economies and said, look, how can any kind of all the trillions of economic decisions that are made in an economy in a given year, even a basic small economy, how can government possibly manage all that and manage the preferences and foresee the future, and know what should be produced and what should be consumed? It's too hard of a job. It's too difficult. Nobody's got that much wisdom. Instead, let people figure this out on their own. And I know that a lot of people don't like the idea of having to figure things out on one's own. And that's one of the downsides of a pure capitalist society, is that we are mostly in the pure form on our own. And that is a very frightening thing to some, and which is why we've got this intermediate ground that I'll talk about here in a minute. But a pure command economy is where the government will decide this for you. Now, in the old Soviet Union, we had all kinds of bottlenecks where maybe there was a shortage of toothpaste because they didn't produce enough. So you go several weeks without having any toothpaste available. Outcome, clearly. Or wild shortages in food production, or wild excesses in production of other things. And instead, suppliers could have been doing other things instead of overproducing something like wheat. Maybe they could try to sell it and dump it to the rest of the world, or maybe too much steel, whereas they could be making other things as a result. So the idea of command economy, they're kind of going away as a thing. You've really only got maybe a handful of true pure command states. North Korea, I think some people talked about North Korea as being really sort of the last holdout of a very, very dominant government force in the economy. But it's not, I don't think you'd want to live in North Korea. And in fact, North Korea, if you want to talk about shortages, they have had massive food shortages to the point where at one point, I think it was estimated that some 2 million people starved to death. And we don't see that happening in capitalist societies. In fact, it's very rare that anybody starves to death today in the modern industrial world. If they do, there's usually something else going on, some sort of mental problem, some sort of substance abuse problem. There's something that's more, it isn't an economic, it's very particularized with an individual. Capitalist societies have been known for more abundance, certainly in these command economies. North Korea is not a particularly happy, healthy place, no question about it. Cuba still has some elements of command still hanging on. To start something like a restaurant is a big, big, big deal, where you've got to get all kinds of licenses and lots of restrictions, lots of people stopping by to inspect and see what's happening, and controls on the prices you can charge and all these kinds of things. And so Cuba's still hanging on, but also Cuba is also a country where people driving cars that were built in the 1950s. It is also not a very particularly prosperous country, despite the fact that they've made advances in other areas. Economically, it is not a particularly productive place. And so very limited private property and profit incentives exist in this pure command model, which again is becoming less common. Let's talk about socialism here, because this is one that I think is particularly, a lot of Americans had trouble with this one because they sort of link the last two together, and that they probably should not be. I think we've sort of, over time, mistaken socialist societies, socialist economies for command economies. And it doesn't help matters that those who were truly command economies actually call themselves socialist economies. The old Soviet Union stood for USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Well, they had efforts at pure command, even though they call themselves socialism. Socialist economies, I usually refer to them as like the 31 flavors. It is not possible to refer to socialism as one thing, because there are all kinds of adaptations and different ways of handling this throughout the world. Socialism in one country doesn't look like socialism in another. So there are probably more than 31 flavors. There are all kinds of different examples. And some of them are changing over time. France had a socialist society throughout the 1980s that radically flipped around on its head and went back to more pure capitalist economy for a very short period of time. Italy has had a very socialist system that also sort of reversed course. And so socialism is essentially this. It's the idea that we take away some of the rough edges of capitalist society where we are more or less on our own, whereas the government, when we say public, we're talking about the government essentially, comes in and says, okay, we will provide for a lot of things that is government will provide for some of these things. By the way, you can look at some of the Scandinavian countries, which I think most of us would not at all consider pure command, but they primarily are mostly socialist economies where you've got government taking over things like Norway, for instance, which is sort of the land of my ancestors. The oil industry is owned by the government, and they pump a lot of oil, and that's good for them because they are then therefore allowed to provide lots of basic services like free education through college and graduate school and getting a doctorate and all that. It's all essentially paid for. Telephone service, healthcare, it's all simply provided by government. It is also characterized by high taxation, no question about it. High taxation is one of the few systems. I know that in these Scandinavian countries, which have been primarily socialist, but I think are still today, got very high taxes, even though tax rates have come down. But I know that at one point in time, I believe it was Sweden that actually had the very highest tax rate on individuals, around 85%, which is really high compared to where we are in this country. I don't think that would fly here unless we did get free housing and free telephone, free healthcare and transportation and all these things. When we talk about basic industries, we're talking about the idea of these very large industries that impact everybody, whether it's electricity, water, transportation, telecommunications, all these things tend to be controlled by government. And in some cases, some countries have moved more towards socialist systems with all the variety and variation of it. Some have moved away. Britain, for instance, was very much a socialist state right after World War II, until about the early 80s, in which Britain, the railroads were nationalized and it's taken over by the government. The airline, British Airways, the BBC was a government operation. It actually still is, for the most part. And they've got all these different channels and whatnot. But at one point, though, some of these were split back off, sold back out to the private sector. So Britain has sort of been moving away in the other direction. So these aren't nailed in stone because, as I mentioned before, everything changes in economics. Okay, nothing is of a long-term nature. These things do change, but these are the idea of systems. So we're talking about pure command. We're talking about this extreme government control over what's going on. We're talking about socialism. It's not really one thing. It's a lot of different kind of elements. And by the way, I think there are elements in the United States. We have long sort of held ourselves out as being mostly purely capitalist society, but there are elements of socialism even within our economy itself. When we talk about healthcare, these socialist states tend to all have a government-provided healthcare. And by the way, government-provided healthcare is the norm, even throughout the industrial world, even throughout most of these countries that are mostly pure capitalist. But we have some of that here as well with Medicare, where people 65 and over, they don't have their own health insurance usually unless they want it, but you get it through Medicare. Or if you're a veteran and then you qualify, you've got health coverage. Or poor children, or poor families in general through the Medicaid program. So there are elements of these that we have even in our society, despite the fact that we've sort of always held ourselves out as a purely capitalist system. Okay? All right, so questions about anything with regard to these systems. I know that we talked a bit about this in our discussion. I did want to cover it here so that everyone is familiar with what is going on as far as that goes. Okay? All right, I want to talk, this is the second piece that I had decided for week 4 that we would talk about. And then as we transition into next week, we'll talk a bit more about the history of economics. And the reason I do that is because a lot of times it's important to know, if you want to understand what's happening now, you've got to understand how you got there. So that's where we're going to be starting with next week. But some more basics here involves government's roles, plural, in the economy. And as I was producing this list, it occurred to me there are probably a lot of other roles that I'm not capturing. And you may be looking at this list and thinking, well, you forgot about this, you forgot about that. I probably did. Where does government fit in? We talked about government in the circular flow model as the public sector actor that is, unlike the private actors, households and businesses that make decisions privately and in their own self-interest. We're saying that government acts in the public interest generally when it works officially, and where decisions tend to be made publicly. That is, bills are passed by Congress and we can see what they are. They're not, yes, there are things that go on behind closed doors within government, certainly. And the effort has been over many years to try to pry open those doors so we can see what's happening. But government's got a number of roles to play. And I don't want to focus so much on things like national defense and whatnot, because I want to more focus on the economic aspects. But provision of public safety certainly is an important one. Going all the way back to Thomas Jefferson, who said, and he was a big proponent of limited government. Limited government. He thought the government should do less, not more. And when in doubt, government should do nothing. And he was one of the original founders of the United States, obviously. And today, I think a lot of people wonder, why doesn't the government do this? Why can't the government do this? And I think it's important to keep in mind that when our system of government was set up, it was set up so that the government would do little as opposed to more. And I know that sounds really wrong to a lot of people, but it was designed to be that way. It was designed to make things hard to get through. But Jefferson himself said, look, if government's not going to do very much, at least the minimum they can do is provide public safety. Public safety at a minimum. And in fact, he used that term, public safety, which today means something different than what it meant then, I think, right? I don't know that fire departments were that big of a thing. In fact, the early fire departments were for-profit enterprises. We don't have a lot of those. There are in some rural areas, we have either volunteer or some private fire departments, not so much anywhere else. Public safety is sort of a given, the government provides it. And so if you need to call 911 because something is going on, police and the fire department will come, whether you paid your taxes or not, whether you're a citizen or not, whether you are a law-abiding citizen or what, they will come and try to take care of your problem. That's one of the roles that they play. And it's an important role and we all pay for it. Whether we pay our taxes or not, we get that benefit of it. The criminal and civil court system, and that is we've got a large system of judiciary, both at federal and state levels. It's one of the functions that government plays. National defense obviously is a big role. If you take macro, at some point in your future, you'll probably have some exposure to just how much we do spend on national defense, which is far larger than any other country in the world by far, by far, by far, by far. And it's a big aspect of our government's role in the economy. And I know that it sounds like it's maybe not economic, but it is, given how much we vote to national defense. Public education, which tends to be more of a state issue, although the federal government has certainly weighed in many recent decades by offering things like Pell Grants and Stafford loans, things of that nature. Of course, the president just within the last several weeks announced a reduction in student loan indebtedness for those who already have outstanding student loans. I don't actually know if it's going to impact all of you who are getting student loans now. I don't know. I haven't really delved into what that's about at the federal level. That may be something obviously you would want to look into, whether or not this sort of amnesty is going to extend to you when you're through right now, that sort of thing. Public education, though, is a big issue. Business regulation, we're going to talk more about that a bit later. This idea of how we regulate production and how it's not just what we produce, it's how we produce it, how we regulate businesses in terms of employing labor, environmental standards they have to adhere to, safety standards. We don't want businesses producing dangerous products that are going to hurt people, which, by the way, the tobacco industry came under lots and lots of government scrutiny about 30 years ago or so, to the point where a lot of people were saying that cigarettes were the most dangerous product made, because if you use them exactly as intended, they could kill you, where most other goods are not like that. If you use a chainsaw, yeah, it could kill you, but if you use it exactly, trouble it won't. Most people don't have trouble with chainsaws or table saws, but they could, particularly when they're not using it exactly as intended. But cigarettes came under lots and lots and lots and lots of scrutiny because of that. So as a result, business regulation intended to improve the public safety. And we're going to talk more about that toward the end of the semester when we talk about, we've got some bits and pieces we'll talk about with regard to regulation. And then finally, the one I wanted to talk about here, and I'll probably sort of stop here and pick this up on week 5 next week, is this idea of economic management or stabilization. What we call stabilization policies. How do we smooth out the ups and downs of what is the inevitable business cycle that is the ups and downs of economic activity? Because we know that economies fluctuate, and I've said a number of times just in today's class session, the economies grow, fall back, grow, fall back. Just like markets will grow and retrench and grow again and fall back. And so things are moving all the time. It's like a kaleidoscope. You turn the little wheel on the kaleidoscope, and it isn't just one thing that changes, everything changes, everything shifts and things are moving. But how do you keep it so that we don't have wild booms and busts, boom, bust? Which, by the way, was the experience in the United States in the 1800s, during the very beginning of industrialization. We had wild booms and huge busts, huge depressions that lasted forever. And when we think about a depression, I doubt anybody here has ever lived through an actual economic depression. We had a recession that was COVID induced. We had another one in 2008, 2007, 2008. Those are downturns that are temporary. Depressions are when you get just a collapse in the economy, massive unemployment, massive lack of confidence, nothing is really happening. And we had lots of those throughout the 1800s. But we've learned a lot more about how to manage the economy to stabilize these things. There are two elements. The first is fiscal policy. That has to do with our elected officials. And we're talking mostly here at the federal level, frankly. Not so much the state level, the federal level, President and the Congress. And we'll certainly talk more about those actors next week. And monetary policy, which is I've talked a bit about today. That's the actions of the Federal Reserve and trying to control the money supply. One of the things that I'm going to talk about as we go forward is the idea that there really are two economies. And that's the idea, there's the economy for goods and services, and then there's the money economy. And I sort of alluded to this with the circular flow model. You've really got two economies. You've got all of us going to work and buying and selling goods, but then you've also got money that's floating around out there. It's a little bit harder to get your arms around. When they're out of whack, though, you've got economic problems. And that's a lot of what stabilization seeks to do, particularly this monetary policy piece. And we're going to see a bit about what that's, how that works, how it operates, who does it, who's responsible for it, what their roles are, etc. So that's a good jumping off point for next time. And when we finish that, we'll talk about fiscal monetary policy next week. Then we'll get into some of the next content, takes us into a little bit of the historical background, some of the theoretical and philosophical background. Are there questions for me about anything that I can answer? In today's class. Well, if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I know I've got a couple of questions pending in email from people. I will get back to you. Wednesdays are kind of very busy days, and I don't have a lot of office time. Prior to class, I've just got about an hour or so. And increasingly, I want to sort of get down here and set up the class. But feel free to reach out to me. Meantime, everybody have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye. Okay.